Secret Army supplies. Game, set, and match. Time to get going, Colonel Vladimir Astronev said to Colonel Misha Bareyev.
10, 9, 8, 7.
Astronev felt his muscles tense.
6, 5, 4.
Bareyev felt his hands perspire.
3, 2, 1.
There was a thunderous roar as the rocket's engines blazed into life. A huge cloud of smoke erupted from the tail. The men in the space capsule felt a violent shuddering as the rocket slowly rose into the air. The control room resounded with the cheers of the scientists and invited VIPs as the banks of television screens all showed the same picture. Icarus I soaring through the blue sky, blazing a trail of yellow flame behind it. The cheers died down and were then renewed as everyone saw the first stage of the rocket's engine fall away, their function to provide the impetus for liftoff fulfilled. Meanwhile, thousands of feet above, the two astronauts had recovered from the intense shock of the blastoff and were slipping into the routine that had been drummed into them at training school. For 3 days, they remained in space. They joked with their radio contacts in the Space Center about the effects of weightlessness, and the technicians on the ground laughed enviously as they watched the television pictures of the two spacemen floating around in the capsule, free from the effects of gravity. Now it was time for Astronev and Bareyev to return to Earth. All that remained for them to do was to crawl through a narrow doorway out of the main spacecraft and squeeze their way along a tube that led to the small, lozenge-shaped craft fixed to the side of the larger one. As soon as they were safely aboard, the flick of a switch would blow the bolts that held the smaller spaceship in position and fire the rockets that would power their homeward journey. Then, when they were a safe distance from the mothership, the twist of a radio dial would send a signal that would detonate the explosives aboard the mothership and blow her into a million tiny pieces. The Potslovians wanted no trace left to show that they had joined the space race. Time to go! The two men looked around the chamber that had been their home for the past 3 days. They both shrugged and moved towards the metal door. The butterfly nuts were soon removed, and there was a teeth-grinding scraping as they slid the door to one side. It was a tight squeeze, but they made it as quickly as they could into the little space capsule. It was much more cramped than the larger one, but if things went according to plan, they would be back in their own country within 10 hours. They buckled themselves into their seats and waited with a growing sense of impatience, for they were now anxious to get home, for the signal from Mission Control to start their journey back to Earth. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire! Astronev leaned forward and flicked the switch. Instantly, there was a series of muffled explosions as one by one the bolts were destroyed, followed by a louder one as the rockets were fired. The space capsule juddered as it was blasted from the safety of its parent ship's shelter and off into space. Bareyev smiled at his comrade. Everything was going smoothly, but the smile slowly faded from his lips. Something was wrong. Astronev should have been relaxed in his seat, waiting for the signal to blow up the larger ship. But his hand was already poised over the radio dial. Suddenly Bareyev heard the hissing of escaping gas. His eyes danced from dial to dial and then fixed on the oxygen supply tank. The needle was veering violently towards the danger level. Next to it, the indicator on the tank containing the other gases being pumped into the astronauts' breathing gear was falling. With every breath they took, both men were breathing more and more oxygen. Already, Bareyev could feel himself becoming lightheaded. He looked back at Astronev, who was staring at him with a look of crazed glee in his eyes. "Let's do it now. We'll get home quicker." "No!" screamed Bareyev, desperately grappling with the heavy buckles that were holding him to his seat. But it was too late. With a loud chuckle, Astronev turned the dial. By now, the oxygen was getting to Bareyev. Both men heard the huge explosion that followed. Their craft shook and shivered as it was showered with thousands of bits of fragmented metal. To the two astronauts, it sounded as if it had been caught in a violent hailstorm. Gradually, as the tiny capsule pulled away from the center of the explosion, the rat-tat-tat of the metal raining on it died away. All that could be heard inside was the steady burning of the rockets, the hissing of the escaping gas, and the crazy giggling of the two astronauts. The hissing stopped. Somehow the leak must have sealed itself, for the two needles began to move back to their normal positions. As the mixture of gases the men were breathing began to balance, they slowly began to realize what they had done. They started to check all the controls to assess the damage. At the same moment, both men looked at the gyro compass and gasped. The explosion had rocked them off course, and they were spiraling back to Earth to land thousands of miles off course. They both grabbed for the controls at the same time and pulled violently to try to set their vehicle back on its true path. It was useless. The explosions had jammed the rocket directional gear. "Where are we going?" whispered Astronov, his voice curiously calm. "I don't know," replied Bareyev in the same cool tone. "But one thing I do know." "What's that?" "Wherever it is, it's a long way from Potslovia." Men's final day at Wimbledon. Control's secretary knew that there were 364 days for which she could make appointments for her boss. 365 in a leap year. But this was the one day he insisted was kept free, no matter what. He arrived at the All England Club at 12:30 and enjoyed a delicious lunch, courtesy of Lotacci Electronics, before making his way to the Royal Box. He relaxed in his chair for a few minutes. All around he could hear the excited buzz of tennis enthusiasts, keenly anticipating what had been heralded as the final of the century. John Floyd of Britain, the most dashing and exciting player ever to grace the centre court, versus Jean-Paul Versailles, the man with the Hollywood looks and the game to match him. At 1:55 precisely, their Royal Highnesses entered the Royal Box. Control stood stiffly to attention until they were comfortably seated. A few moments later, there was a tremendous roar from the crowd as the two finalists came onto court. They stopped, turned round, and bowed to their Royal Highnesses. No sooner had the royal couple acknowledged this charming courtesy than Control felt someone tap him on his shoulder. "Excuse me, sir," a voice whispered in his ear. "There's an urgent call for you." Control sighed and slipped discreetly from his seat. A little later, he left the office and returned to his seat in the Royal Box. "What's the score?" he asked the man sitting next to him. "Versailles just lost the first set, 6-2. Floyd on form, huh?" muttered Control, and spent the rest of the afternoon agonizing with the others in the crowd as the Frenchman took the next two sets and Floyd the fourth. Then, just as Versailles was serving the first game of the last set, there was a terrific flash of lightning, followed seconds later by a clap of thunder, at which point the heavens opened and play was suspended until the following morning. The storm raged for the rest of the day. It was still raining heavily later that evening when three men were sitting in an anonymous room in the secret army heliport in Wiltshire. From outside they could hear the huge raindrops crashing against the window. "I wish Wings would hurry up," said one of the men. No sooner had he spoken than there was a squeal of cars' brakes that sent a shower of pebbles scattering in all directions, drowning the sound of the storm outside. "That'll be him now." He was right. A few minutes later, they heard footsteps running along the passage that led to the room, and then the door flew open. "Whoa, there are cats and dogs," said the man who stood in the doorway. "This is ridiculous." There was a loud crash as he slammed the door behind him. "Okay," he continued. "Where are we off to this time?" "We'd better play the tape and find out," someone said, leaning forward to switch on a tape recorder, the only thing on the table in the middle of the room.
Some days ago, we learned that the Potslovians had launched their space capsule. They tracked it while it was in orbit, and then something went wrong. We know that the two astronauts aboard were under orders to blow it up as soon as they were safely on their way back to Earth in their ship. But some reason they pressed the button too soon and were blown off course. Crash landed in the middle of the Sahara yesterday morning. We want hits, the men aboard, and the data they collected while they were up there. But we think it came down close to Tamam Rasset in Algeria. Oh, by the way, you won't be the only one looking for it. The Potslovians will have men out searching for us. And probably the Russians, who don't want any other Eastern Bloc countries to join the space race. And you may come across some of our allies.
The tape stopped. "Okay, let's get going," said Wings. "How?" asked one of the others, a tall, thin man codenamed Spanner. "Chopper to the aircraft carrier, and then we'll jet down to Africa," replied Wings. The four men made their way to the launch platform of the heliport, climbed aboard one of the fleet of helicopters, and strapped themselves into their seats. Wings, at the controls, gave the thumbs-up sign to one of the mechanics standing nearby. There was a deafening roar as the roof slid back. The helicopter rose from the deck, and hovered a few feet in the air for a moment or two before soaring upwards and off into the night. The wind was blowing gale force as the helicopter struggled southwards towards the Dorset coast to rendezvous with the secret army aircraft carrier. Wings wrestled with the controls to keep the fragile aircraft on course. Won't be long now. He had to shout to make himself heard above the throbbing of the engine and the roaring of the wind. "What?" yelled Spanner. "I said..." Before Wings could repeat what he had said, the night was lit up by a terrific flash of lightning that streaked through the sky. The thunderclap that followed almost immediately was so loud that it drowned the sound of the helicopter engine. At the same moment, the aircraft began to quiver violently. It was as if an invisible hand had taken it in its grasp and was shaking it like a gambler shakes his dice. Then it was as if the dice had been thrown. With a violence that no one aboard had ever experienced, the helicopter began to plunge downwards. Suddenly, everything went into slow motion. Another flash of lightning. It lasted for a few seconds, but to the men on the helicopter, it seemed that the world outside was bathed in bright light for minutes. The ground below began to spin like a child's kaleidoscope. A tree flashed by, then another, then another. There were 4 short explosions, followed by the sickening sound of metal crunching into rock. The shrieking of the storm was drowned by a tremendous boom as a spark caused by the friction flared into the fuel tank, blowing the chopper into a million fragments that showered through the night like a swarm of dancing fireflies. No one on board could possibly have survived the impact of the crash, let alone the resulting inferno. The night was filled with the cracking of thunder and the roaring of the flames that engulfed the shattered secret army helicopter. The flames lit up the area for miles around. Wings, whose ejector parachute had become entangled in the branches of a tree, was dangling in the air like a stricken puppet. The other 3 had been luckier. When they had pressed their ejector buttons, they had been blown hundreds of feet into the air. Their parachutes had opened up with a great rushing and billowing of silk, and they had floated safely down to the ground, landing a safe distance from the blazing aircraft. Even from there, they had felt the intense heat. "Get me down from here!" A voice rose above the crackling of the huge tongues of flame that shot up into the sky. They looked around and saw their entangled friend looking for all the world as if he was suspended in the air. "So that's why he's called Wings," grinned Sandfly as the 3 ran to the tree to rescue their pilot. With monkey-like agility, Shamrock scrambled up the tree. The blade of his knife glinted in the firelight as he cut through the strands of strong silk. "Ready to fall!" he shouted as he cut the last one. Wings braced himself, and a few seconds later, with a dull thud, he landed on the soft soil below. "Whoa, that's a close shave," he said. "How far do you think we are from the aircraft carrier?" "About 10 miles, I reckon," said Spanner. "Yeah, which way?" It was mid-morning by the time they neared the bay where the secret army aircraft carrier was docked. As soon as they had showered, they headed for the wardroom. They could hear the welcome sound and smell the tantalizing aroma of sizzling bacon and eggs. A coffee machine was bubbling away in the corner. "Oh, I didn't know I was so hungry," said Wings between mouthfuls of breakfast. As soon as they had finished, they went to the flight deck and climbed aboard one of the jets. There was a heavy clunk, followed by the scraping sound of the wheel blocks being hauled along the deck. Wings checked the controls, and when he was satisfied that everything was in A1 order, he flicked a switch. With a roar, the engines fired. The men braced themselves as the huge catapult thrust the plane forward, giving them the velocity for takeoff. The plane zoomed along the deck and up skyward across the English Channel. "Where are we going to land?" shouted Shamrock. "Well, according to intelligence, there's a disused airstrip between Abalessa and Tamanrasset." They flew on, and eventually Wings began to take the plane down. It skimmed through the sky a few hundred feet above the featureless landscape. Then in the distance, Wings saw a long strip of dull grey concrete. "That must be it," he shouted. A few minutes later, the 4 men had opened the door of their plane and had jumped onto the ground. The first thing to hit them was the amazing heat. The sun beat down on them from out of a cloudless blue sky. All around was sand. "According to the map," said Sandfly, "there should be an oasis about a mile in that direction." No sooner were the words out of his mouth than a bullet zipped through the air, landing some way in front of them and sending a cloud of sand into the sky. The first was followed by another, then another and another, until the sound of gunfire was all around and sand was flying all over the place. The 4 men spun round and dropped to their knees, drawing their guns as they did so. They were being followed by a band of white-robed Arabs, each one brandishing a wicked-looking rifle. But the men were no match for the expert marksmanship of the secret army. They didn't have to aim to kill, for so accurate was their fire that they could shoot the guns from the enemy's hands as easily as they could eat apple pie. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Wings and the others rose to their feet, and their guns pointing at the now harmless band ahead slowly moved towards them. To a man, the Arabs put their hands in the air as a gesture of surrender. "Okay, what was all that about?" Wings spoke through gritted teeth. "English," said one of the Arabs, and smiled broadly. "Yes," said Wings. English. We thought you were our enemies. For many years now they come to our land, steal our animals, plunder our oases." "Huh, what do you do?" "We kill them. But not you. The English are our friends." "Well, thank God for that," Sandfly muttered to himself. "Why you come here?" the leader asked suddenly. "You come to fight other soldiers who swarm over our land." "What other soldiers?" asked Wings. "The American other soldiers, the French other soldiers, the Russian other soldiers, and the others that speak in the language we cannot understand. Ever since the metal box fall from the sky, our desert is like the waiting room at United Nations." Do you know where the metal box is now?" "Of course. First the ones with a strange language find it. Then the Americans, they find it. They have it now." "Where?" 10 miles the other side of Narrated. "Could you lead us there?" "And help you get it from the Americans?" "Well, if you can." "It will be an honor. But first, we must make a plan." The Arab leader said something in his own language to his men. Immediately they all ran off and had soon disappeared behind a nearby sand dune. A few minutes later they appeared, each one leading a pair of camels. "I don't think I'm going to like this," said Shamrock. The others seemed to enjoy the ride, but for Shamrock it was a nightmare. He hung on grimly, wobbling like a jelly all the way to the town. The line of camels entered it through one of the huge wooden gates in the glistening white walls of the old fort. Instinctively the camels came to a halt and knelt down. With effortless ease, everyone, apart from Shamrock, slid down to the ground. He tried to dismount, but as soon as he made his attempt, his beast stood up. With a deafening roar, Shamrock fell off the camel and landed right in a nearby watering trough. A second or two later, the spluttering, shaking soldier surfaced and shook himself like a dog after a bath, showering his 3 laughing comrades with drops of water. I'm soaked," he coughed. "No, don't worry about that," said Wings. "We're going to buy Arab robes in the bazaar." Were led into a tent hung with long flowing robes and Arab headdresses. The cool shade was a welcome relief after the shattering heat of the marketplace. "What's the plan?" asked Sandfly. "Well, we dress up as Arabs and pretend we belong to Akal's men. He'll lead us to where the Americans are holding the space shuttle." The 4 men removed their desert kit and pulled Arab robes off hangers on the wall. They dragged them over their heads, which they then covered with light, long, scarf-like pieces of cloth held in place by silk twine. But rather than use the sashes that were offered, they fastened the robes with their secret army belts, to which were clipped their guns, grenades, and other things that would probably come in useful over the next hour or two. "I don't know what I look like," grinned Sandfly, "but if you lot are anything to go by, I must—" Before he could finish, there was an ear-splitting roar. One of Akal's men raced into the tent and said something to his leader. No sooner had he spoken than the door flap flew open and 6 evil-looking Bedouins burst through the space. Akal stood up and bellowed at the top of his voice, drawing his dagger as he did so. The commotion attracted the rest of his men who had been drinking tea at a nearby shop. They raced into the gloomy tent, swords at the ready. Within seconds, a tremendous fight was in progress. Sword sparked against sword, daggers flashed. One of Akal's men ripped a roll of cloth from a shelf and threw it with all his might at the enemy. They were knocked off their feet, but were soon up again. More men ran in from outside. Akal's men were outnumbered. "Surrender!" cried the enemy leader. "Never!" roared Akal. Wings looked around and noticed that the side walls of the tent were made of a much lighter silky material than the heavy canvas of the roof. "Akal!" he shouted. "Try and get your men fighting with their backs to the side walls." Akal yelled a few words. It took some minutes for his followers to maneuver themselves into the position that Akal had ordered and fighting off their attackers, who were now grouped in the center. Wings unclipped a miniature stun grenade from his belt, pulled out the pin, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. As soon as he reached 10, he rolled the bomb like a marble into the center of the room. There was a tiny chink as it hit its target, and then a small explosion. Small, but powerful enough to bring the tent pole crashing down, trapping the enemy troops in the cascade of heavy canvas. All that Wings and the others had to do was to roll backwards through the lighter side walls, and they were out in the marketplace again. It was curiously quiet. In fact, there was complete silence, which was broken a second later by the click of a rifle being loaded. Wings didn't know much Russian, but he knew just enough to understand that someone had just told him in that language not to move. He looked up. He and the others were surrounded by armed soldiers, the rifles aimed in their direction. The secret army and Akal's warriors were led at gunpoint to a nearby truck and forced to climb aboard. Soon they were through the huge door and out into the desert. Looking back, Wings watched as the white walls gradually became smaller and smaller and then disappeared from view altogether. "What's happening?" he asked Akal. "That dog, Hashal, is in the pay of the Russians. He knew that I'd found out where the metal box is and told his masters. But worry not. One of my friends in Taman Rasset will get word to the rest of my men. Help will soon be at hand." The convoy sped on across the seemingly endless desert until it came to a halt at a small oasis. The guards jumped down and beckoned the others to get off the truck. They were led at gunpoint to a tent in the middle of the oasis and forced inside. Pairs of handcuffs dangled high up all around the sides of the tent. Each man in turn was forced to raise his hands above his head and could do nothing while the cuffs were securely locked. "I know how a leg of lamb must feel in the butcher's shop now," said Wings cheerfully, trying to keep everyone in good spirits. "How long do you think we'll be left hanging around for?" asked Sandfly. "As long as it takes to get the information we need," said a voice. The men heard the tent flap being pulled back and blinked as bright sunlight flooded into the tent. "Never," spat Akal. "Oh, we'll see," said the officer who had entered the tent. He snapped his fingers and 2 soldiers came in, each holding newspapers and kindling wood. The officer nodded and said something. The men moved towards Akal, and while one of them pulled a chain that raised the Arab off the ground, the other squashed the newspaper into balls which he put under his feet. Then he laid the sticks among it. "You wouldn't!" yelled Spanner. "We will. In 1 hour, unless your friend tells us what we want to know." With that, he snapped his fingers, and the 2 soldiers scurried out. A minute passed. Then another. No one spoke. Suddenly the silence was broken when a soldier entered the tent. He marched briskly up to Akal and said something. The Arab laughed softly and said, "You see, I told you we would soon be rescued." "What?" said Wings. "Rescued. It seems that our friends outside are not as efficient as they appear. They only left 1 guard on duty at the flap while the others went to eat. One of their men against one of mine who knows the way of the desert. How to conceal himself, how to move unheard, how to stun with 1 soundless blow. Now we must be quick. Are the keys in the uniform you're wearing?" The man nodded. It was not long before all had been released and were rubbing their painful wrists. "What now?" asked Spanner. "We wait for the signal," said Akal. He sent the man who had rescued them outside to drag the unconscious guard into the tent. Then he told him to stand watch outside. No one said a word. Suddenly the silence was broken by the loud screech of what sounded like a desert eagle. Akal stiffened and then began to count. 58, 59. Now! Immediately the men in the tent heard the baaing of what sounded like thousands of sheep. Akal dashed forward and ripped the tent flap open. Everyone raced out into the open. Soldiers were spilling out of a nearby hut, looking on in astonishment as a vast flock meandered through the oasis. The noise they made was incredible. Suddenly, some of the sheep seemed to stand up. Their skins dropped from them, and before the astonished eyes of the secret army, a troop of gun-toting Arabs appeared. The soldiers fired wildly into the flock, but they were heavily outnumbered and soon retreated to their tent. The Arabs, still firing to keep the soldiers pinned in their tent, disentangled themselves from the sheep and shouted to Akal. "Make for the jeeps!" cried the Arab chief, running as fast as he could towards the vehicle compound. The others followed. The engine of one was racing when the men got there. They sprang aboard and were soon speeding away from the oasis, closely followed by their rescuers and the Arabs who had been locked up with them, all on camels that had been tethered to palm trees at the far side of the compound. "Where to?" shouted Spanner.
To our own oasis,
said Akal, who was at the wheel. "What if we're followed?"
we won't be, yelled Akal. A little sand in the petrol tanks of the other jeeps and trucks should have seen to that.
As he spoke, he turned and grinned widely at the men from the secret army.
Look out!
Screamed Wings as a huge rock loomed up in the desert in front of them. The startled Akal swerved violently, so violently that the force knocked Shamrock in the back seat off balance. He flew through the air and landed in the sand right in the path of the camels galloping close behind.
Shamrock!
Wings' scream was lost to the wind as he looked on helplessly. His comrade lay still on the ground. A few seconds later and he would be dead, every bone in his body crushed by the charging camels. Akal pulled hard on the steering wheel and slammed his feet on the brakes. The jeep skidded to a halt out of the path of the oncoming camels. Wings forced himself to turn round and see what was happening. He blinked in astonishment as just as it looked as if Shamrock was going to be trampled to death, the leading rider, with all the agility of a circus stuntman, swung himself down from his camel's back and, still holding onto the reins, scooped the senseless secret army soldier up and threw him onto the camel's back. Then he righted himself. The camel didn't even change its stride until the rider pulled hard on the reins and brought it to a halt. A few minutes later, Shamrock was lying on the back seat of the jeep, and the convoy set off again towards Akal's oasis. By the time they got there, Shamrock had regained consciousness and shook his head in disbelief when the others told him what had happened. "Just as well I was out cold," he said. "I'd have died of fright if I'd seen it." "Best get some sleep," said Akal, ushering the secret army soldiers into a large tent. "We set off at dawn tomorrow morning." It was surprising how cold it had become now that the sun had set. The four men wrapped themselves in heavy rugs and were soon sleeping soundly. It was still dark when Akal wakened them next morning. Over bowls of thick black coffee and platefuls of dates, he told the men that one of his scouts had just come back from where the metal box was. "The Americans still have it," he said, "and there is a group of French soldiers in the area as well." "Let's get going," said Wings. "How?" asked Shamrock, with an anxious tone in his voice. "I suppose it means camels again?" "Right," said Akal, leading the men out of the tent to the spot where the camels were grazing on what little grass there was on the oasis. They mounted the clumsy-looking animals and were soon ambling across the desert. The British soldiers were becoming used to the curious gait of the desert animals and almost enjoyed the ride. After about an hour, they neared a high ridge. Akal, who was at the front of the camel train, signaled for the others to stop and dismount. "The metal box is beyond," he said. "We leave the camels here and continue on foot." The 8 men crept up to the peak of the ridge and peered down into the valley below. There, glinting in the bright sunshine, lay the lozenge-shaped space capsule. Uniformed men were attaching heavy chains to it and digging heavy-duty jacks into the sand on which it sat. They were obviously going to load it onto the back of a truck parked a little distance away. "Hey, you guys!" a voice called out in a heavy American accent. "Let's take 5. Everyone stopped working and sat in the shade of the truck. Akal signaled to Wings and pointed across the valley. From their vantage point, they could see a handful of soldiers creeping up on the Americans, obviously planning to catch them unawares. "What do we do?" asked Wings. "We wait, and then we take the metal box from whoever wins it." The men on the ridge watched in quiet fascination as one of the attackers put a large bazooka in position and cranked it until the tubular barrel was obviously at the right angle. The dozing Americans were oblivious to what was happening behind them. They were chatting quietly among themselves when suddenly there was a flash, followed by a loud explosion as the rocket from the bazooka hit its target. Taken by surprise, the Americans had no chance. The battle that followed the rocket attack was short and swift. Within a few minutes, they were all trussed up like turkeys. One of the victors took a walkie-talkie from his tunic and spoke into it. A minute or two later, a large lorry roared across the valley. The defeated Americans were forced at gunpoint onto the back of it, and as soon as they were aboard, the lorry sped off, sending up a cloud of dust into the sky, and then disappeared from view. Wings counted the men left in the valley. "There's 12 of them and 8 of us." "Yes, but we have surprise on our side," said Akal. "What's the plan?" "We wait until they're busy loading the metal box onto the truck, then we go over." The relentless sun beat down on the 8 men on the ridge as they watched the soldiers in the valley below carry on where the Americans had left off. When the chains were secured around the space capsule, one of the soldiers ambled across to the truck and jumped up into the driver's seat. The sound of the engine roared out across the desert. The driver accelerated hard and the lorry zoomed off away from the capsule. There was a heavy crunching sound as he jammed on the brakes and wrenched the gear into reverse. With the driver's foot still hard on the accelerator, the lorry roared backwards towards the rest of the men gathered round the capsule.
Who does he think he is? Asked Wings. Nigel Mansell?
The lorry came to a shuddering halt a few inches from the space vehicle, which was blackened from the tremendous heat that had been generated as it crashed through the Earth's atmosphere. One of the men jumped up onto the back of the truck and swung round the small crane sitting on the back. Soon everyone was intent on attaching the hook to the chains that bound the capsule.
Now!
Shouted a cow. The 8 men charged down the ridge into the valley, showering bullets as they ran. The soldiers below spun round, leaving the space capsule dangling in the air. They were well trained. In an instant they had formed 2 lines, the 5 in the front kneeling and firing at the approaching attackers, while the 6 behind loaded their rifles. When the front line had exhausted their ammunition, the men in the row behind ran forward and knelt down while the others fell back to reload.
Cover me!
Yelled Sandfly as he started to crawl on his stomach like a snake and headed for the abandoned bazooka about 400 yards away. From where they were, Wings and the others could see Sandfly crawl across the desert unnoticed by the enemy soldiers. As soon as he made it safely to the bazooka, the secret army and their Arab allies intensified their fire. Bullets ricocheted all round. The relentless gunfire rang across the valley. A burst of bullets from Spanner's gun sprayed the space capsule. It was as if a manic tap dancer was practicing on the flat metal surfaces. Then a new sound joined the symphony of gunshots and flying bullets. The heavens seemed to have opened and a shower of stones was falling from the sky. The men in the valley were caught in a violent storm of rocks and falling debris. No sooner had the last stones fallen, knocking out several of the enemy, than a loud explosion heralded a second fall of heavy rocks. With a blood-curdling roar, Akal charged forward, the others a few steps behind. The men who had survived the surprise attack from the sky above threw down their weapons and raised their arms in the air. Sandfly came racing to join his comrades.
There were no rockets left, he shouted, so I made do with what I could find.
Well done, said Wings. But they had forgotten one thing. The driver in the cabin of the lorry.
Look out!
Screamed Spanner as the truck thundered towards them. The men scattered like flies out of its path. But Shamrock was not going to let the hard-won prey get away so easily. With a death-defying leap, he soared through the air and managed to grab hold of one of the chains that had slipped from the space capsule. The others watched in horror as he was dragged along behind the powerful truck as it sped off. Summoning every ounce of his strength, Shamrock strained all the muscles in his body as he pulled his way along the chain and climbed up onto the space capsule. Then he ran along the back of the truck and leapt up onto the cabin roof. Praying that the radio aerial would take his weight, he grabbed hold of it and twisted his body out into empty space. Thankfully, the aerial was stronger than it looked. It took the weight of the soldier's body as he flicked around and kicked his way through the window of the driver's door. The man didn't stand a chance. He tried desperately to keep the vehicle under control while fighting off Shamrock's frenzied attack at the same time. The lorry careered wildly while the struggle continued. Shamrock winced as the driver struck out wildly, clawing at his cheek with long, sharp nails. But the blood that oozed through the cuts only increased Shamrock's determination to win. He threw himself the other side of the lorry and then, holding onto the leather strap that dangled from the cabin's roof, he kicked out. One foot caught the driver fair and square in the back of the neck. The other got him on the nose, turning it into a blood-soaked pulp. He screamed in pain as Shamrock kicked out again, this time at the door, which flew open under the tremendous impact. Once more he kicked. The driver hurtled through the broken door and landed with a sickening crunch on the desert sand. It took Shamrock less than a second to grab the steering wheel and bring the lorry under his control.
There's just one thing I'd like to know, said Spanner when everyone was back at the oasis. Where are the 2 astronauts?
Oh, they're here, grinned Akal. My men found them wandering in the desert, quite lost, a day or 2 ago.
Now, why didn't you tell us?
Snapped Wings.
Because, my friend, you didn't ask. Never tell anyone anything unless you're asked.
There's one thing I'd like to ask, said Shamrock.
What?
I don't suppose you know who won the men's finals at Wimbledon, do you?
No, I don't. But I do know who won the real men's final in the desert today. I'd say it was game, set, and match to the secret army. With,
he went on, nodding to some of his men,
a little help from my friends.